September 1939. I was 15 years old, living in a small town just outside London. Back then, the air smelled of fresh rain and coal smoke. The streets were always alive with chatter, the newspaper boys yelling headlines I didn't quite understand, until that one morning when I heard my father say quietly to my mother, "It's begun." At first, I didn't know what he meant, but when the church bells started ringing, not for celebration, but as a warning, I knew. The world had changed. The radio crackled in the kitchen. The Prime Minister's voice, calm but heavy, announced that Britain was now at war with Germany. My mother dropped the teacup she was holding. It shattered on the floor, and somehow, that sound stayed with me longer than anything else that day, because that was the sound of normal life breaking. In the weeks that followed, posters appeared everywhere. Keep calm and carry on. But the calm was gone. Air raid drills became part of our days. Blackout curtains covered every window at night. And when the sirens wailed, we ran to the underground shelters, clutching gas masks and little bags of bread. I remember the first air raid. It was late, maybe past midnight. The sirens screamed, mothers shouted for their children, and the ground shook like thunder under our feet. I looked up once before running, and I saw the sky glowing orange. London was burning. Down in the shelter, people huddled together. Some prayed, some sang softly, and there was this old man who played harmonica, trying to keep the kids distracted. He smiled at me and said, "You'll remember this night, son." Maybe not the fear, but the faces. He was right. I still remember every face. Days turned into weeks. Our school turned into a volunteer center. My best friend Charlie and I helped carry water and supplies to families who'd lost their homes. We thought it was heroic. We didn't understand what death really was. But that changed one morning in October, when I went to Charlie's house and found only rubble. A German bomb had fallen right where his family lived. The whole street was gone. Just gone. I don't remember crying that day. I remember silence and a kind of numbness that a boy of 15 shouldn't have to feel. That's when I realized this wasn't just grown-up business anymore. This was our world too, being torn apart. Winter came. Cold, dark, endless nights. We rationed food. We learned to live without light. But somehow, people still laughed, still shared what little they had. Sometimes when the bombing stopped, neighbors gathered to tell stories, bake tiny loaves of bread, or just listen to the radio together. Those small moments felt bigger than anything else. One evening, as snow fell over the ruins, I saw a girl about my age handing out warm soup to soldiers passing through town. Her name was Eliza. She smiled like she'd never seen war at all. That night, she gave me a cup of soup and said, "As long as we share warmth, they can't take everything from us." I didn't know it then, but that girl would become a part of my story in ways I could never have imagined. By 1941, the bombing slowed. People started to rebuild, but hope was fragile. Every night, we listened to the news from across the Atlantic about a place called Pearl Harbor and how America had now entered the war. I remember my father whispering, "Maybe now we won't have to fight this alone." He was right, but we didn't know then what that really meant, because the world was only just beginning to burn. And that's where everything changed, when the war stopped feeling like something happening to us and started feeling like something happening through us. January 1942. The winter felt longer than any before. Frost climbed across the inside of our windows each morning. The war had stretched into its third year, and I was 16 now, older in number, but still a boy, really. I'd started helping at the local supply depot, stacking crates and delivering food to the shelters. Every morning, the trains would whistle through, carrying soldiers east toward the front lines. We'd wave at them. They'd wave back, hats raised, grins forced. But we all knew many of them wouldn't be coming home. Eliza was there too. She volunteered beside me every single day. Sometimes she wore her brother's old army jacket, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back with a red ribbon. She laughed often, maybe to keep the darkness away. We became friends. the kind you only make during times when life feels uncertain. I remember one night, while we sorted bandages by lantern light, she asked, "Do you think this war will end before we're old?" I smiled and said, "We'll be old before it ends." We both laughed, though neither of us really thought it was funny. Outside, the bombs still fell from time to time, but people had grown used to the sirens, like thunder in the distance. When they wailed, we didn't panic anymore. We just moved quietly to the shelters, sat in silence, and waited. That was the rhythm of war, a rhythm you could never forget. In May of '42, something changed. American soldiers began arriving, tall, loud, confident, with their bright uniforms and chewing gum and smiles that looked untouched by fear. To us, they seemed like heroes from another world. They brought jazz music too, and chocolate. Real chocolate. I still remember the taste, rich, smooth, like a dream cutting through months of gray days and powdered food. That night, Eliza danced to a jazz tune outside the depot, spinning in the dust as the soldiers clapped. For a moment, we forgot there was a war at all. But the war never forgot us. It had a way of showing up when you least expected it. One evening, we were unloading supplies when the air raid sirens screamed louder than ever before. Then, the earth shook. A bomb fell just a few blocks away. The blast threw me off my feet, dust and glass raining down. When I stood up, everything was smoke. I called for Eliza, but there was no answer. Hours later, when the fires had dimmed, I found her. Alive, thank God, but injured. A beam had fallen near her leg. She smiled through tears and said, "You didn't think I'd leave you to do all the work, did you?" Even hurt, she tried to make me laugh. That was Eliza, light in the darkest room. The next weeks blurred together. She recovered slowly and we carried on. But the laughter was rarer now. We both felt it. The weight, the exhaustion, the fear that maybe the world would never be the same again. Then came 1943. Rumors spread that the Allies were preparing for something big. Men whispered about invasions, plans, turning points. No one knew details, but hope started to flicker again. Small, fragile, but real. I was 17 then. I'd learned to fix radios, carry messages, patch bullet holes in trucks. I wasn't a soldier, not yet, but I felt like one in my bones. Every friend I had either left for the front or waited for a letter that never came. One cold March night, I was on guard duty outside the depot. The sky was clear, filled with stars, the kind of stars you only see when there are no lights left in the world. And then I heard a sound, low at first, then rising. Engines. I looked up. Dozens of planes flying in formation, heading east. Their silver wings glinted in the moonlight. For the first time in years, the sound didn't scare me. It filled me with something different. Pride, maybe, or belief. That same night, my father came to me. He was older now, face thin, eyes tired. He handed me his old watch and said, "You'll need this more than I will." I didn't understand until the next morning, when he left, called up for duty again, though his age should have spared him. He just said, "Men are short, son. I can't stand by while others go." I never saw him again. Months passed. The war moved closer to its peak. Supplies ran low, food ran thinner, but the sense of purpose grew. People started saying D-Day is coming. We didn't know what that meant, but it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then came June 1944, the day we'd all been waiting for, though we didn't realize it. Word spread. The invasion of Normandy had begun. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, the Americans, the British, the Canadians, all fighting together to take back Europe. Eliza and I sat by the radio, listening as the news came in piece by piece. Static reports. Names of beaches we'd never heard before. Omaha, Utah, gold. We didn't speak for hours, just listened, because for the first time in years, the voice on the radio wasn't warning us to hide, it was telling us to hope. That night, the town bells rang again, not for danger, but for faith. People hugged strangers, shared what little food they had left, cried and laughed at the same time. Even the soldiers at the depot danced in the streets. I saw old men lifting children onto their shoulders, shouting, "We're taking it back! We're taking our world back!" I looked at Eliza. She was smiling through tears, and in that moment I realized something simple. We were still alive. After all the loss, after all the fear, we were still here. But the war wasn't over yet, not even close. As the front lines moved east, they called for volunteers to help with communications and supply transport across France. And I, now 18, signed up, not out of bravery, but because I couldn't bear to stand still any longer. Eliza didn't try to stop me. She just pressed a small folded note into my hand and said, "Promise me, when this is all over, you'll come back, and we'll start from wherever we left off." I promised her, and then I left. I didn't know it then, but that promise would carry me through everything that came next, through fire, through loss, through the kind of moments that change a person forever. August 1944, France. The air smelled like smoke and mud and gasoline. I was standing in a uniform that still felt too big for me. The war had moved across the sea, and now we were chasing it, mile by mile through towns that looked like ghosts. Buildings shattered, roads torn apart, people peeking from cellars with hollow eyes, afraid to hope again. I was assigned to a supply convoy, trucks carrying food, medical kits, and ammunition to the front. Every road was a risk. Every bend could be an ambush. We didn't talk much. We just drove. Eyes on the horizon, hearts pounding quietly. One night, as we crossed a bridge near Caen, the sky erupted. German artillery found us. Shells whistled overhead. Flashes of light, dirt exploding everywhere. Our driver yelled, "Down!" But before I could move, the truck beside us went up in flames. The blast threw me into the ditch. My ears rang. My hands trembled. When I stood, the bridge was gone. Just fire and twisted steel. Half the men never made it out. And in that chaos, I realized something that never left me. That courage wasn't about running toward gunfire. It was about getting up again, even when every instinct told you to stay down. We buried them the next morning in a field of wildflowers. No priest, no flag, just silence, and the sound of crows in the distance. I remember writing in my little notebook that night, "If I ever make it home, I'll never take silence for granted again." As we pushed deeper into France, I started meeting people. Villagers who had lost everything, yet still offered us bread, wine, a smile. I met a woman who'd hidden 2 American pilots in her cellar for months. She told me, "You boys, you bring light again." I didn't feel like light, but her words stayed with me. Then came winter of '44. We were stationed near the Ardennes, the thick forests of Belgium. Cold, bitter cold. Snow that turned your hands blue and your breath into smoke. The enemy launched a surprise attack. The Battle of the Bulge, they called it. We were surrounded for days. No food, no communication, just snow and gunfire. I can still hear the sound of boots crunching on frozen ground, the moans of wounded men calling for help, the way silence would fall between shots, heavy, unnatural. I remember one young soldier, barely 17, crying softly as he clutched his rifle. He looked at me and said, "I don't want to die out here." And I told him, "Then we won't." I don't know if I believed it, but sometimes in war, a lie can save a life. After a week of siege, the skies cleared. American bombers broke through the clouds, and when the first plane swooped low, we all cheered, weakly, but with everything we had left. We were saved. When the fighting stopped, I walked into the forest, alone, and saw the sunlight piercing through the branches, melting the snow. For the first time in months, it felt like the world was breathing again, but the joy didn't last, because news started spreading. Whispers of places the Germans had built. Camps. Camps where people were taken and never came back. We didn't believe it at first. How could we? The story sounded impossible until we saw it. April 1945. We reached a camp near the German border. I'll never forget that day. The gates were open, barbed wire twisted like snakes. Inside, silence, and the smell, a smell you can't describe. It was the smell of death, of suffering, of something the human mind shouldn't have to understand. We found survivors, thin as shadows, wrapped in blankets, staring at us like we were ghosts. One of them, an old man, held my hand and said, "Don't look away, son. The world must never look away again." I didn't. None of us did. We walked through that place with tears in our eyes and rage in our hearts. And I knew then, this war wasn't just about land or nations. It was about saving humanity from itself. A few days later, word came. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was ending. But no one cheered. Not really. We were too tired, too broken. I sat on the steps of a ruined farmhouse that night and took out Eliza's note, the one she'd given me before I left. It was worn and folded, the ink faded from sweat and rain. It said, "When this is over, come home. We'll start again from wherever we left off." I read it over and over, and for the first time in years, I let myself believe that I might actually make it home. May 1945, victory in Europe, VE Day. The streets of London filled with people singing, waving flags, crying. I wasn't there, not yet, but I could picture it in my mind. The bells ringing, the lights coming back on, the sky filled with color instead of smoke. When I finally returned weeks later, I walked through streets I barely recognized. Some buildings still in ruins, others decorated with ribbons and laughter. And there, near the old depot, stood Eliza. She saw me before I could even call her name. She ran, tears streaming down her face, and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. No words, no explanations. Just that moment, alive, real, whole. We sat on a bench near the Thames that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. And for the first time in years, I heard people laughing again, children playing, music drifting through the air, life returning. Eliza looked at me and said, "You kept your promise." I smiled and replied, "So did you. You kept the world warm." The war ended, but it never truly leaves you. You carry it in memories, in scars, in the silence that comes when fireworks sound like bombs. But you also carry something else, the proof that even in the darkest times, humanity refuses to disappear. Years later, people would ask me what the war was like, and I'd tell them it was horror, it was heartbreak, but it was also courage, it was friendship, it was love written on scraps of paper that somehow survived when whole cities didn't. And maybe that's the real story, that even when the world fell apart, people still found ways to hold each other together. I was 15 when it began, 18 when I thought it would never end. And now, I'm an old man. But sometimes when I hear thunder rolling across the sky, I still think of that night in London. The sirens, the fire, the faces in the shelter. And I whisper quietly to myself, we made it. We're still here. Summer 1945. The guns had stopped. The sky was quiet, but silence can be louder than any explosion. The first days of peace felt strange. People didn't know how to act. After 6 years of war, laughter sounded unfamiliar. The smell of smoke still lingered in the streets of London, like a ghost refusing to leave. Eliza and I walked through what used to be our neighborhood. Whole blocks were gone, flattened, but people were already rebuilding. Men with hammers, women sweeping rubble from doorsteps that no longer had doors, children drawing with chalk on broken walls. Somehow, life was coming back. One afternoon, I visited my old home, or what was left of it. The garden was gone, the windows shattered, but the front gate, somehow, still stood. Rusty, half-hanging, but there. I pushed it open and stood in silence. I could almost hear my mother's voice calling from the kitchen, my father's radio humming softly in the corner. I sat on the ground and whispered, "We're home now." The wind answered back with nothing but stillness. In those first months, people talked about starting again. But starting again isn't simple. The war had taken pieces of us that couldn't be replaced. Friends, brothers, time. Every night I'd wake to dreams, gunfire, sirens, faces I'd seen only once and never again. They call it memory. but it felt more like a shadow that followed me everywhere. Eliza helped me through it. She was stronger than anyone I knew. She started working with the Red Cross, helping families find their missing loved ones. Some days she'd come home with a smile, having reunited a mother and child. Other days her eyes would tell a different story. We didn't talk much about the bad days. We just sat together, quietly, sometimes holding hands, sometimes not saying a word. It was enough. In 1946, we married. Not in a church, there were still too many ruins, but in a small garden behind a rebuilt cafe near the river. A few friends, some borrowed flowers, a soldier's band playing softly in the background. When Eliza walked toward me, the sunlight hit her hair just right, and for a second, it felt like all the darkness had lifted. She smiled and whispered, "We made it." And I believed her. We didn't have much. A single room, ration cards, and a dream of normal life. But it was ours. Every morning we woke to the sound of hammers, London rebuilding itself, brick by brick. Every evening we'd walk by the Thames, holding hands, watching lights flicker on the water. It wasn't the same city as before the war, but maybe that was the point. Neither were we. Still, the memories came. Some nights I'd wake up gasping, hearing planes that weren't there. Eliza would hold me until my breathing slowed. She'd say, "It's over, love. You're safe now." And I'd nod, but deep down I wasn't sure safety existed anymore. In 1948, the rationing finally began to ease. Shops reopened, music returned, people danced again. Jitterbug, swing, jazz, like they were trying to erase the silence with rhythm. I remember standing outside one of those dance halls one night, just watching. Young men in suits, girls in bright dresses, laughter spilling into the street. And I thought, maybe this is what winning really looks like. Not flags or parades, but people smiling again. That same year, Eliza and I had our first child, a daughter. We named her Hope, because that's what she was, the proof that life continues. When I held her for the first time, tiny and warm, I realized something I hadn't felt since before the war. Peace, real peace. Not the kind signed on paper, but the kind that lives quietly in your heart. Still, the war followed me. Whenever I heard thunder, I flinched. Whenever a plane passed overhead, I looked up without meaning to. Sometimes when I walked through the city, I'd see faces that reminded me of the boys I'd lost. And in my mind, I'd whisper their names, like a prayer, so they wouldn't be forgotten. In 1950, 5 years after the war, London was almost unrecognizable again, full of color, noise, and motion. Children who had never heard a siren grew up playing in streets once marked by craters. The world had moved on, and slowly so did I. Eliza and I opened a small shop, a book and stationery store. Nothing grand, just a place where people could sit, read, and breathe in the scent of paper instead of smoke. We called it the Quiet Corner. Funny name, maybe, but after all those years of noise, that's all I'd ever wanted. A quiet corner of the world to call my own. Sometimes veterans would come in, old soldiers, younger men, faces lined by memories that mirrored mine. They'd tell stories of battles, friends, losses, and we'd sit together in silence afterward. Because some stories don't need answers, only understanding. I remember one rainy evening, an American tourist walked in. He looked around, smiled, and said, "You know, I was here once, back in '44. We fought through France together. We talked for hours about the convoy, the cold, the music, the fear. And before he left, he said something that stayed with me forever. We didn't just fight a war, son. We built a world worth living in." I watched him disappear into the rain and thought, maybe that's true. Maybe all that pain wasn't for nothing. Soft, nostalgic pause. By the late 1950s, the world had changed again. Television, new music, new politics. But I still carried that 15-year-old boy inside me, the one who'd watched the sky burn over London. And every time my daughter asked, "Papa, what was the war like?" I'd take a deep breath and say, "It was loud. It was long, but we survived, and that's what matters most." Because survival isn't just about breathing, it's about remembering, about building again, about finding love in the ashes. And somehow we did. Eliza and I built a life not out of what was left, but out of what we still had. Each other, our child, our quiet corner. I often think of the ones who didn't make it back. Charlie, my father, the nameless soldiers buried under foreign soil. Sometimes late at night, I whisper their names before I sleep. Not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Because their silence gave us our tomorrow. And even now, and decades later, when I walk by the river at dusk, I can still hear echoes. The distant hum of planes, the faint laughter of children hiding in shelters, the whisper of a girl offering soup to a scared 15-year-old boy. Eliza passed those memories on to Hope before she died, and Hope, in turn, tells them to her own children now, because that's how history lives. Not in books, not in monuments, but in stories whispered across generations. When people ask me what I remember most about those years, I tell them, it wasn't the bombs, it wasn't the fighting, it was the moments in between, the laughter in the shelter, the taste of chocolate after months of hunger, the sound of bells when peace returned, those small, fragile moments that reminded us we were still human. Summer 1946. The war was over, but inside, it still echoed. They said peace had returned, but no one told us how to live with it. London was a skeleton of its old self, walls rebuilt from ashes, streets full of people who smiled, but with eyes that looked somewhere far away. Maybe we were all trying to find ourselves again in the ruins of what used to be normal life. I tried to pick up where I'd left off before the war. But how do you return to being 15? When you've seen what I've seen? And every loud noise still made my body flinch. Every flash of lightning looked like another bomb. Nights were the hardest. I'd wake to the sound of sirens that weren't there. Sometimes I'd dream of faces, the people I'd met, the ones I'd lost, and I'd reach out to them, only to wake up with my hand in the dark. My mother said I talked in my sleep. She'd sit beside my bed and whisper, "You're home now, love. You're safe." But a part of me never really believed her. One morning I went to visit the old train station, the one we used to pass through on our way to evacuations during the Blitz. The roof had been rebuilt, the tracks polished again, and standing there was Eliza. I froze. She looked older, stronger, the same soft eyes but with a quiet sorrow in them. We stood there, not saying anything for a long time. Finally, she smiled and said, "I thought you were gone." I laughed softly. So did I. We sat on a bench and talked for hours, about nothing and about everything. How she'd lost her parents during the bombings, how she worked in a small hospital now, tending to wounded veterans, and how she still carried that same stubborn hope from the days of war. Before she left, she said, "You should visit the ward someday. There are boys there who still think the war isn't over." Her words hit me deeper than she knew. So I did. The next week I walked into that hospital, and the smell of disinfectant and damp stone brought everything back. Men missing limbs, faces bandaged beyond recognition. But what struck me most were their eyes, hollow, distant, just like mine. One of them, a boy named Thomas, couldn't have been more than 19. He'd lost both legs in France. He told me he still dreamed of running. I feel them sometimes, you know? My legs, like they're still there. Then I wake up, and they're not. I didn't know what to say, so I sat with him every day. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just listened to the rain on the window. After a few weeks, he said something I'll never forget. Maybe healing isn't about forgetting what happened. Maybe it's about learning to live even when the pieces don't fit anymore. That night, I wrote his words down, because they were true and they still are. Months turned into years. Eliza and I grew closer, not in the way of fairy tales, but in the quiet, fragile way that broken people do. We'd walk by the river, talk about the world, about the things we still wanted to believe in. She once asked me, "Do you ever feel guilty for surviving?" I hesitated, then said, "Every day." She nodded. "Then live for the ones who didn't." That's the only way to make peace with it. By 1950, life was slowly taking shape again. The world was rebuilding, dreaming of brighter tomorrows. But under the surface, the memories of war still lingered, unspoken, unhealed. Men like me worked in silence, carried our ghosts quietly, smiled when expected. But deep down, we were still hearing the echoes. One evening, Eliza took me to a small concert in town. A pianist played a slow, haunting melody. I think it was called The Last Light. And when the notes filled the air, I saw people cry, softly, silently, not out of sadness, but release. It was as if, for a few moments, music gave us permission to feel everything we'd buried for years. Afterward, Eliza leaned close and whispered, "You see? The world still remembers, not through fear, but through beauty." I realized then that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about learning to find beauty again, even in a world that once lost it. Sometimes I walk through the streets of London now, and when I see children running, laughing, free, I think of Charlie. I think of Thomas. I think of the old man in the shelter playing the harmonica. And I feel this strange mix of sorrow and gratitude, because they never saw the peace we dreamed of. But somehow, I did. And that's when I understood something my father once said before he passed away. "The war will never leave you, son. But it's your choice what you do with its memory." So I chose to tell the story, not of battles, not of medals, but of people. The ones who held hands in the dark, who shared bread when there was none, who chose kindness even when the world gave them every reason not to. And though the guns have long gone silent sometimes, when the wind blows through the old streets, I can still hear faint echoes of the past. The laughter, the songs, the promises we made to each other. That even after the darkest nights, the dawn always comes. 1953, 8 years since the guns fell silent. But peace never felt as simple as it sounded. The world was rebuilding faster than anyone could have imagined. Factories worked day and night. New cars rolled out onto clean streets. Children laughed in schoolyards again. And yet, something in the air felt different. It wasn't the sound of bombs anymore. It was the silence before something else, a different kind of fear. They called it the Cold War. But to those of us who had already lived through one world ending, this new kind of tension felt colder than anything we'd known. One evening, I sat in our small living room with Eliza. The radio hummed with reports of nuclear weapons. The most powerful bombs ever made. People whispered that one day, the whole world could vanish in a single flash of light. I remember Eliza turning the radio off and saying, "We spent our youth trying to survive one war, and now the world is already building the next one." She wasn't angry, just tired. We both were. By then we'd married. A small ceremony. No flowers, no grand speeches, just a few close friends and the sound of rain outside the church window. When she walked down the aisle, I remember thinking, after everything I'd seen, this moment felt like the first real victory of my life. We moved into a quiet part of the city near the Thames. I found work at a printing press, making newspapers. Ironic, really. Printing stories about a world that refused to stop fighting. Every morning, headlines screamed of Korea, of the Soviet Union, of spies and suspicion. And every night, I'd walk home, wondering if humanity had learned anything at all. Then came 1955, the year I became a father, a baby boy. We named him Daniel. When I first held him in my arms, he looked at me with the kind of peace I hadn't seen since I was a child. So small, so unaware of what the world was capable of. That night, as he slept beside Eliza, I whispered, "You'll never know the things I've seen. Not if I can help it," but deep down, I knew no parent could promise that. Life moved on. Daniel grew fast, curious, bright, always asking questions about everything. He'd look at my medals sometimes, the few I'd kept in a box. Once he asked, "Dad, were you brave?" I paused, because I didn't feel brave. Not then, not ever. So I said, "No, son. I was just there." And I tried to do what was right. He thought for a moment, then said, "That sounds like brave to me." And I remember smiling. but also feeling that familiar ache, because I didn't want him to ever learn what brave really meant in a world like ours. The 1950s brought new inventions: televisions, cars, space talk, but also new fears. People built bomb shelters in their backyards. Schools taught children how to duck and cover. We'd already seen one world go up in flames, and now we were preparing for another. Sometimes when the sirens for air drills went off, "Just tests," they said, I'd freeze. My hands would shake before I could even think. Eliza would take my arm, whisper, "It's just practice, love. Just practice." But to me, every siren was the same sound from 15 years ago, the sound of the sky falling. And yet, amid all that fear, life still found ways to be beautiful. Daniel's laughter filled the house. Eliza's voice when she hummed old songs in the kitchen made even rainy mornings feel golden. Sometimes we'd sit by the river at night, watching the city lights shimmer. Eliza would say, "Do you think the world will ever stop being afraid?" And I'd answer, "Maybe not. But maybe that's why we have to keep remembering, because forgetting was the first step to repeating it all." As the decade ended, I started writing again. Not news stories, about the war, about the people, about Charlie, about Thomas, about Eliza's soup and the harmonica man who kept us calm underground. I didn't write them for fame or bookshelves. I wrote them because I couldn't bear the thought of them fading away. Every word felt like a promise kept. One winter evening, Daniel found my old notebook. He read a few pages quietly, then looked at me and asked, "You really saw all that?" I nodded. He closed the book slowly and said something I'll never forget. "Then I think your generation was both cursed and blessed." I smiled sadly. "How so?" "Cursed to live it," he said, "blessed to survive it." I didn't know whether to cry or hold him, so I just did both. By the time the 1960s dawned, the world had changed again, and so had I. But that's another story. For now, I still remember that night, the first time my son said goodnight, and the silence that followed wasn't filled with fear anymore, but peace, real peace. 1962. The world felt young again. Bright colors, new music, new dreams. Everywhere you looked, there was movement. The kind that made even the weary start to believe again. Daniel was a teenager now. He'd grown taller than me, with that same spark in his eyes that Eliza once had. Curious, stubborn, full of questions. The kind of boy who believed he could change the world. And maybe he could. London had changed. Gone were the bombed-out streets and ration lines. Now cafes buzzed with chatter, buses rolled smooth on clean roads, and radios played the Beatles instead of war bulletins. Sometimes I'd stand on a corner, close my eyes and listen. The laughter, the engines, the songs. And I'd think, this is what victory sounds like. But then late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd still wake up to sounds that weren't there. The hum of planes, the whistle of falling bombs. Echoes, always echoes. One morning, Daniel asked if he could join a protest. Something about peace, about nuclear weapons. He said, "If we don't speak up now, Dad, we'll repeat your war all over again." I looked at him, his youth, his passion, and I realized he was fighting a different kind of battle. Not against nations, but against memory. He was trying to build a world where people didn't have to remember what I'd lived through. "Go," I said quietly. "But remember, peace isn't loud banners and chants. Sometimes it's just choosing kindness when no one's watching." He smiled, the same half smile Eliza used to give me when I tried to sound wise. And then he went, full of hope. That night, Eliza and I sat by the window watching the rain. She whispered, "Do you ever wonder what it's all for? All we went through?" I thought for a while. "Maybe," I said, "so they could live without knowing how fragile life really is." She nodded, her eyes soft. "Then it was worth it." Years passed like wind through an open door. Daniel went to university. Eliza opened a small clinic, helping widows and children of veterans. I kept writing. Little stories, bits of memories, sometimes letters I'd never send. And slowly, The war began to fade, not from history books, but from conversation. At dinners, people didn't talk about it anymore. New wars had taken the headlines. New faces filled the newsreels. And sometimes that silence hurt more than the noise ever did. In 1969, I remember standing outside one evening, looking up at the sky, and hearing that humanity had landed on the moon. For a moment, I felt this strange mix of wonder and disbelief. We had once destroyed cities from above, and now we were walking among the stars. It made me realize we humans are capable of both the worst and the most extraordinary things. And maybe, just maybe, the balance between them is what defines us. Daniel came home that summer with long hair, a guitar, and wild ideas. He talked about freedom, art, love, things we once didn't have the luxury to imagine. At first, I didn't understand him. He seemed so different, so far from the world I knew. But one evening, he sat me down and played a song he'd written. It was soft, quiet, about peace, about memory, about light returning after darkness. When he finished, I just sat there, unable to speak. He looked at me and said, "I wrote it for you, Dad. For everything you survived." And for the first time in decades, I let myself cry, not from pain, but from pride. By the time the 1970s arrived, life had slowed. Eliza and I had grown older, she with her soft gray hair and the same smile that had carried me through every storm. Our home was small, filled with books, laughter, and the smell of tea. Sometimes she'd look at the newspaper and shake her head. New wars, new faces, same mistakes. She'd sigh, and I'd answer, "That's the world, love. It forgets so easily." But she'd always reply, "Then we'll keep remembering for them." And we did. In 1974, on our anniversary, I took Eliza back to the river, the same one where I'd once lit that candle when the war ended. We stood in silence watching the reflection of city lights on the water. I said, "You know, it still feels like yesterday sometimes." She smiled gently. "Maybe that's because yesterday never really leaves us. It just changes its shape." That night, as we walked home hand in hand, I realized something I hadn't understood before. We survived not because we were strong, but because we refused to stop believing that life, no matter how broken, was still worth living. The world was moving forward. The war was a story now, one told in classrooms, in films, in fading photographs. And yet, for people like me, it was still right there, under the skin. But seeing my son grow, seeing people laugh again, seeing the world choose love over fear, even for a moment, made me believe that maybe, after all this time, humanity was finally learning. At least I hope so. The world kept turning. Faster now, quieter in some ways, louder in others. By 1981, the city I once walked through as a young soldier had changed beyond recognition. Neon lights, tall glass towers, cars that purred instead of roared, and people who never looked up. Sometimes I'd sit at the same park bench near the river and wonder, how much of what we fought for still matters to them? Eliza would tease me, say I sounded like an old poet lost in thought. She wasn't wrong. I'd grown quiet, not out of sadness, but because I'd learned that silence often holds the truest stories. Daniel had moved out by then. He was working as a journalist, writing about wars I didn't even know how to pronounce. Different continents, same mistakes. Sometimes he'd call, his voice restless, full of fire, and I'd feel that old ache again, that fear that history never really ends. It just changes its costume. In the summer of 1984, Eliza fell ill. It started small, a cough, a little fatigue. But weeks turned into months, and soon our home was filled with the quiet hum of machines and the smell of medicine. I remember one night sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, and she whispered, "Do you remember the night you found me by the river? All those years ago?" I nodded, unable to speak. "You said the world would never be the same again," she smiled faintly. "And you were right. But I think we found something better than the world. We found each other." Her fingers trembled in mine, and I realized, sometimes love isn't about how long it lasts. It's about how deeply it changes you. while it's here. She passed away that autumn. The trees outside were turning gold. The kind of gold that doesn't shine, but glows softly, like memory. The house felt impossibly quiet. For weeks, I'd wake up and still listen for her footsteps. Sometimes I'd even speak aloud, forgetting she wasn't there to answer. And then, I began to write again. Not about war, not about pain, but about love, the kind that survives even when everything else fades. By the 1990s, Daniel had a family of his own. He brought his daughter, my granddaughter, Lily, to visit one spring. She was 7, bright eyes, endless questions. "Grandpa, what's that metal?" she asked, pointing to the small bronze star on my shelf. I told her it was from a time when people thought bravery was about fighting. She tilted her head and said, "But isn't bravery about caring?" And just like that, with one sentence, she rewrote everything I thought I knew. The world was unrecognizable now. Television showed wars in color, news traveled faster than emotion, and people scrolled past tragedy like it was just another story between commercials. Sometimes I'd think, maybe humanity isn't cruel. Maybe it's just too distracted to care. But then I'd watch Lily laugh, her tiny hands holding a camera, trying to capture the world before it disappeared. And I'd feel hope again. Hope that maybe this new generation wasn't here to remember our pain, but to build something better from it. On quiet evenings, I'd still sit by the window, a cup of tea cooling beside me. I'd listen to the city hum, the same city that had once screamed in terror, and I'd whisper, "We made it, Eliza. Somehow, we made it." Sometimes I'd feel her there, not as a ghost, but as a warmth in the air. A feeling that the world was still capable of kindness, if only people slowed down long enough to feel it. As I grew older, people started calling me a veteran, but I never liked that word. It sounded too official, too distant. I wasn't a veteran, I was a witness to what happens when the world forgets its own humanity, and to how love can bring it back again. And even now, when my hands tremble as I write, I know one thing for certain. The greatest victory of my life wasn't surviving the war. It was learning how to live after it. Slow, peaceful close. The years no longer scare me. Time isn't an enemy anymore. It's just another storyteller. And as it turns each page, I see faces I loved, places I lost, and moments that remind me, even silence has its own kind of music. It's strange, isn't it? How life can stretch across decades and still feel like a single moment when you look back. It's the year 2003 now. The world outside my window is full of noise. Cars, planes, cell phones, people rushing like they're running from time itself. And yet, here I sit, in the same chair, by the same window, watching the same sun I watched as a boy, when the sirens first wailed over London. My hands tremble a little more these days, so I write slower. But this letter, Lily, is for you. Not because I'm leaving soon, but because I want you to remember the things the world forgets too easily. When I was your age, I thought heroes were the ones who carried rifles. Later, I thought they were the ones who survived. Now, I think the real heroes are the ones who remember and keep kindness alive in a world that keeps trying to burn it out. Do you remember that summer we planted tulips in the backyard? You asked me why flowers die so quickly, and I told you because they remind us to appreciate the color while it lasts. That's what life is, Lily. A brief bloom of color between two eternities of silence. But it's enough. It's always enough. Sometimes I still dream of the war. Not the explosions or the fire, but the quiet after. The strange silence that felt heavier than the sound of bombs. In my dream, I'm back in that field outside Normandy. The smoke is clearing, the sun is breaking through, and I see faces of men I knew. Laughing, shouting, running. Then one by one they fade, until it's just me standing there, a boy again, holding his breath under a sky that refuses to cry. I always wake up before the tears fall. People often ask if I hate what happened, if I hate the ones who caused it. But truth is, hate is just another kind of chain. It binds you to the very pain you're trying to escape. So no, Lily, I don't hate them, I pity them. Because anyone who can destroy without feeling has already lost everything worth fighting for. The world feels different now. Wars look cleaner on screens. People argue over history as if it's a game. But I've seen what it really costs, and no one wins. Not really. Victory isn't about raising flags. It's about raising hearts after everything you loved has been taken. I sometimes sit and talk to Eliza, out loud, like she's just stepped into the next room and hasn't come back yet. I tell her about you, how you're studying, how you laugh the same way she used to, how the world still spins even after all this time, and I like to think, somewhere, she smiles. Lily, if there's one thing I want you to carry forward, it's this. Never measure life by what you achieve. Measure it by what you give back. Because the world doesn't need more winners. It needs more rememberers, more feelers, more souls brave enough to love in the face of loss. When I was 15, I watched the sky turn to fire. When I was 20, I watched friends disappear. When I was 30, I watched love bloom in the ruins. And now at 88, I watch the sun set through this same old window. And I realize every single moment was worth it. Even the painful ones. Because they all led here, to this quiet peace. Maybe that's what heaven really is. Not clouds or harps or angels. Maybe it's the simple relief of knowing that you did your part, that you loved deeply, that you remembered, and that somewhere someone like you is still listening. So if you ever feel lost, Lily, go stand under an open sky, close your eyes, and listen. If the wind feels warm, that's just me, reminding you that love never really leaves. It just changes form. It's been 3 years since Grandpa passed away. Sometimes it feels longer. Sometimes it feels like he never left at all. I still come here, to this house, to this window. The same one he wrote his letters beside. The same sunlight spills across the old wooden floorboards. It smells faintly of tea and dust and memory. When he died, he left behind boxes filled with notebooks, handwritten pages, stories, sketches, little pieces of thought he never showed anyone. And on top of them all, a letter addressed to me. The envelope was yellowed, edges worn soft from time. Inside, it simply said, "For when the world feels too loud." I didn't open it right away. It took me months. But when I finally did, it was like hearing his voice again. He wrote about the war, about the silence that followed, about my grandmother Eliza, and about how every generation must choose to repeat history or to heal it. His words felt heavier than paper should ever feel, and yet somehow they made the air lighter. I think what I loved most about him was his stillness. He never rushed, never filled silence with noise. He listened to the world like it was speaking only to him, and maybe it was, because now that he's gone, I hear it too. In the wind that rustles the leaves, in the laughter of strangers, in the quiet hum of life moving forward. It's like his voice lingers, not as sound, but as presence. Last month I took a trip to Normandy, the same beaches he once crossed as a frightened boy with a rifle. But when I stood there, the sea was calm. Gentle waves touched the sand where thousands had once fallen. And I realized, time doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. A man standing beside me, old, maybe in his 90s, looked out at the water and whispered, "They were all so young." I didn't know if he meant them or himself. When I came home, I placed a small stone from that beach on Grandpa's grave, and for the first time I didn't cry, because I finally understood what he meant when he said, "The greatest victory is learning how to live after the war." He didn't mean the war between nations, he meant the war within, the one we all fight when the world gets dark. Sometimes I read his old letters to my students, not to teach them about history, but to remind them that history lives inside us. One of them asked me once, "Do you think your grandfather was brave?" I said, "Yes, but not because he fought in a war. He was brave because he kept believing in people, even after everything he'd seen." At night, I still light a candle by the window, the same window he used to sit beside, and I whisper, "Good night, Grandpa." The flame flickers, and in that moment, the world feels quiet again. The same kind of quiet he used to talk about, the kind that isn't empty, but full of peace. Slow, cinematic close, gentle orchestral feeling. People say time heals all wounds, but maybe it's not about healing. Maybe it's about carrying them gently, learning to live with the weight of what shaped us without letting it break us. Grandpa carried the world once. Now I carry his memory, and maybe someday, someone will carry mine. The sky outside is turning gold. Morning light is breaking through the trees, and for the first time in a long time, I don't feel alone, because the sky never really fell silent. It's still speaking. You just have to listen. It's been more than 40 years since I first opened Grandpa's letter. The pages are yellow now, the ink faded into a brown that looks almost like dried leaves pressed between seasons. Sometimes I still unfold it carefully, afraid the paper might crumble. But it never does. Like the man himself, it endures quietly. I'm older now, older than he was when he wrote it. My hair carries the same silver he used to joke about. My hands have the same soft tremor that once annoyed him when he tried to write a straight line. And every time the morning light spills across this house, I feel him nearby. Not as memory, but as presence. The world has changed again. It always does. Screens glow where books once lay. Voices echo through invisible networks instead of open streets. But behind all that brightness, I can still hear the same old question he carried his entire life. Have we learned anything? I teach history now. Sometimes when I stand before my students, faces lit by phone screens and futures that move too fast, I tell them stories he told me. Not the textbook kind, but the ones with breathing in them. The smell of ash, the sound of sirens, the warmth of soup shared in ruins. And when I finish, the room goes silent in that sacred way only truth can create. Last spring, one of my students, Sam, asked, "Miss Lily, do you think something like World War II could ever happen again?" I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "It already does," I said softly. "Every time someone stops seeing another person as human." He didn't look away after that. He just nodded, like maybe he finally understood what all those pages of history were trying to say. After class that day, I walked down to the memorial garden behind the school. There's a stone there with a single line carved into it. To remember is to rebuild. No names, no dates, just that. I placed a small tulip bulb beside it, one of the same kind Grandpa and I planted decades ago. When the first rain came, the soil darkened around it, and I swear I could feel his hand on my shoulder. Sometimes when dust settles and the sky blushes red over the rooftops, I take my daughter Emma down to the river. She's 17 now, the same age Grandpa was when the war began. She listens quietly as I tell her stories about him. How he carried water during bomb raids, how he met Eliza by chance and never stopped loving her. She always asks the same question: did he ever regret it all? And I always say, no, love. He regretted nothing except that people had to suffer to remember what kindness was worth. Emma usually falls silent after that. She's growing up in a world that confuses speed with progress. But sometimes when she turns to look at the fading sky, I can see it. The same gentle courage that lived in him. The courage to feel. Transition, softer tone. 2 months ago, I finally went through the last box of Grandpa's things. Inside was a small tin wrapped in cloth. It held a camera, an old one, scratched and heavy, the kind that used real film. There were 2 rolls inside. I had them developed. Most of the photos were of ruins, soldiers, streets half crumbled. But tucked at the end was one picture different from the rest. A close-up of a young boy's face, eyes wide, half smiling despite the dust on his cheeks. On the back, Grandpa had written only 3 words: "Before the silence." I stared at it for hours. I realized that was what he spent his whole life chasing. The sound that existed before the silence. Before fear, before hate. The sound of people simply being alive together. That night, I took the photo to my window. The city outside was glowing. Cars, signs, laughter from somewhere distant. I taped the picture to the glass. And in its reflection, for a heartbeat, I saw both of us there, him and me, past and present, meeting in the quiet hum of now. The next morning, Emma found me in the kitchen making tea. She held the photo in her hand and asked, "Mom, what are you going to do with all of Grandpa's stories?" I smiled and said, "I'm going to give them away." Because that's what he did. He gave away memory like light, and light only matters when it's shared. So I started a project at school called the Living Archive. Every student brings a story from their family, of struggle, of hope, of survival, and we record it. No judgment, no corrections, just voices telling truth. We've collected hundreds already. Sometimes we play them in the hallways between classes, and when the speakers crackle with the sound of someone's trembling voice from the past, the entire corridor slows down. Even the noise bows its head. That's when I feel him most, standing somewhere unseen, proud, quiet, smiling. After all these years, I still remember the way the air smelled that morning. It was early winter of 1945, and the war was finally over. People filled the streets, waving flags, crying, hugging strangers they'd never met. For the first time in years, there was laughter in the air. The kind that didn't sound afraid. But for me, it wasn't that simple, because even as the bells rang for peace, I kept hearing echoes of the ones who never made it back. When I walked back through my hometown, it felt smaller somehow. The houses looked tired. The trees looked older. Maybe I was the one who changed. Or maybe the war had aged everything it touched. My mother stood on the porch when I arrived, her hands trembling, her eyes filling faster than words could come out. She looked at me like I was both a stranger and a miracle. That night, we sat quietly by the fireplace. No music, no words, just the crackle of wood and the sound of her breathing beside me. I told her about the friends I'd lost, the nights I thought I'd never see home again, and she just held my hand tighter, as if by holding on, she could pull all those memories out of me. But the truth was, you don't ever really leave the war. It lives inside you, in the way you flinch at sudden sounds, in the way you look at the sky before rain, in the way silence feels heavier than it used to. For years after the war, I worked at a small post office in Illinois. Nothing fancy, just sorting letters, listening to the radio, and trying to build a normal life. Sometimes I'd see young boys in uniforms, laughing on their way to the train station. And every time I saw them, I felt the same knot in my chest, because I knew what they didn't. I knew that laughter doesn't always come back. One afternoon, I received a letter, addressed to a name I hadn't spoken in years, Private James Holloway. He was my best friend in the trenches. We used to trade cigarettes for extra bread and talk about how we'd open a diner together when the war was done. But James never made it home. That letter had been lost in some military archive all this time. Inside it, his mother had written, "Jimmy, your father's been sick. Come home soon. We miss your voice." I read those words over and over until they blurred through my tears. And in that moment, it hit me. How many voices had been silenced before their time? How many dreams never saw the sunrise? Pause, long exhale. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream about those days. The sound of rain on metal helmets, the flash of distant artillery lighting up the sky like thunder gods. And then, silence. That deep, infinite silence that comes after the battle ends. It's in that silence where I hear them again. The laughter of my friends, the echo of our promises, the way we swore we'd live big lives if we ever made it home. And maybe in some strange way we did, because every story I tell, every memory I share, it keeps them alive. Maybe that's what survival really means. Not just breathing, but remembering, carrying the weight of those who can't. Years passed, the world moved on, built highways, sent men to the moon, created color television. But in my heart, I still saw that black and white world of 1940s Europe. Muddy boots, cold nights, quiet bravery. I married a kind woman named Margaret. She knew about the war, but I never told her everything. Some memories are too sacred to be spoken aloud. We had 2 kids. Both grew up free, strong, unafraid. And every time I watched them laugh in the yard, I thought to myself, this is what we fought for. Not flags, not medals, not victory parades, but simple, ordinary moments of peace. Slow fade, voice softens. Now as I sit by my window, an old man with trembling hands and tired eyes, I sometimes think about that 15-year-old boy who once hid under a staircase during an air raid. He was scared, shaking, praying for morning. He didn't know that one day he'd live long enough to tell this story. He didn't know that his scars would turn into lessons, and he surely didn't know that pain could teach compassion. If you ask me what I learned from the war, it's this: that hate can destroy cities, but love, even the smallest kind, rebuilds them. That courage isn't about fighting, it's about enduring, and that every sunrise is a gift, not a guarantee. Sometimes I visit the old memorial park downtown, names carved into cold stone. I trace each one with my fingers and whisper, "You're not forgotten." Then I sit on the same bench I used to as a boy, watching kids run around without fear, without ration cards, without sirens. And I smile, because in their laughter I hear the sound of victory, not the kind written in history books, but the quiet, human kind, the kind that says, "We survived," the kind that says, "We lived." And as the sun sets over the horizon, turning the sky gold and crimson, I close my eyes and for a moment, I can almost hear them again. James, Thomas, Lily, all of them, laughing somewhere beyond the noise of time, and I whisper back, "We made it home, all of us."